summer full of flowers and hope within my heart. The maiden claimed she cared for me, I dared believe it so. Her family approved of me, my hope began to grow. Darkness, a wilderness of snow. Now everything is darkness, a wilderness of snow. When I arrived in May, now deep in darkest winter, it's hard to find my way. The moon has sent a friend to me, a flickering beam of light. I'm grateful for your company. It's lonely here at night. But all you show is endless snow, just white on white on white. But all you show is endless snow, just white on white on white. What point is there in staying? This world was never mine. The rabbit who's kicked away will howl, scratch and whine. But lovers never linger. It's better not to dwell.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to have you here joining us. Just wanted to let you know that that was Winterreise from Franz Schubert that we were listening to, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of a conversation about that song as well as the name of the film, Winter Journey. I'm Pamela Lavitt, the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Strom Jewish Community Center. And it is hard to believe, but it is Thursday, Thursday, March 18th. I've lost track of days, as we all have, but it has been an incredible 2.5 weeks. We are actually screening 3 films over the course of from today and through Sunday. So while the festival apparently ends today, because 2 more films, including our closing night and closing weekend films, All See, as well as My Amazing Funeral, a Leave 'Em Laughing film from Argentina. Today's film and conversation is about Winter Journey. And it was really, for me as a programmer and for our committee, a very obvious choice of film that we wanted to show. First of all, it is the final film of the actor Bruno Ganz. Many of you know him from Wim Wenders' films, but also the film itself is just such an incredible marvel of archival documentary, feature, narrative, non-narrative, reenactment. It just was a marvel. And we are so happy here today to have some special guests with us. But before we do, and I introduce them and ask them to join, I just wanted to tell you that this conversation will go for about an hour. We are recording. We love questions, and there will be plenty of time for those. So we ask, if you are interested or have comments, to please put them right in the chat. I don't mind also if they're in the Q&A, whatever you're comfortable with, we will get to them. I am very, very happy to let you know that that this film, I believe, is screening for one more day. So if you really enjoyed the film, I hope that you will please go tell your friends to go to seattlejff.org, and I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. And I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished guest. Minna Miller will be joining us as the moderator, and I will first say a few words about Minna Miller and Martin Goldsmith. But before I do, I also want to thank our sponsors. I'm so happy to have the Goethe Pop-Up Seattle as a community partner for today's film. They were also a partner for one of our other films in the film festival. And so I want to thank you so much. Great social media presence too. And I also want to thank Mina herself and Music of Remembrance for also being an outreach and community partner for this film and all of the work that you've done in generating interest around it. We had a really great showing of interest. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our special guests and ask that you please go and read their full bios at our Film Festival guest page, and I'll put that in the chat as well. First of all, I'd like to introduce Minna Miller, who has been a collaborator of the Seattle Jewish Film Festival, and many of you know her as an incredible, incredible executive director of Music of Remembrance. Music of Remembrance, of course, has an incredible mission, which is to hear the music of those who created it in the Holocaust, also to learn lessons today about genocide through the act of performing their music and telling their stories and current issues. And Minna, you are an incredible wonder because we've also shown films of yours in the film festival, Videm, and many other things. You have such an incredible spirit and bio. Thank you again for your collaboration. I'm so glad you're here to join us.
Thank you, Pamela. It's truly an honor to be with you tonight.
Thank you. I am so honored to have Martin Goldsmith here. For those of you that saw the film, you never saw Martin. And perhaps, Minna, we should never show Martin, but we are actually going to get to see him today. Martin's voice you hear throughout Winter Journey because it is the story of his own parents based on his second book, which is Inextinguishable Symphony. Sorry, that is his first book, Inextinguishable Symphony, which is about his parents. And of course, his father played by Bruno Ganz, and these interviews were adapted by the filmmaker Anders Ostergaard in an incredible format, which we will be talking about. His second book, which is Alexis's Wake, he can talk about that as well. And for 50 years, Martin has been a voice on radio and classical music, and also has an incredibly distinguished career talking about music. And obviously from the film, you know why, but we're here today to talk about the adaptation of that film. And I please welcome our special guest, Martin Goldsmith. I'm going to see you all in just a little bit, and I'll let the two of you speak together. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you, Martin. So nice to see a face with this voice that I've been listening to for my entire life. And actually, we met 15 years ago on the stage of Music of Remembrance, where we invited you in 2001, shortly after the publication of your compelling book, The Inextinguishable Symphony, to talk about that story. So here we are 15 years later, and your journey has really been carrying on from book to film, and we meet again. And as I said, it's very nice to meet in person because even in the film, we don't see you. So our viewers tonight can enjoy meeting the real person behind the story. So let me ask you, what motivated you to turn this book, based on your parents' story, into a film?
Well, first of all, Minna, it's great to be with you again after those 15 years. It's great to be virtually in the great Northwest. I love Seattle, and I've had the good fortune to visit there a few times. Caught a ring cycle one year. But it actually was not up to me to turn the book into a film. About 5, maybe 6 years ago, right out of the blue came an email into my inbox from a fellow who said, "My name is Anders Ostergaard. I'm from Denmark. I would very much like to make a film based on your book, The Inextinguishable Symphony." And I think there's at least a 50-50 chance that I regarded that first email as more or less coming from a Nigerian prince. I think I ignored that first email, thinking, well, this is too good to be true. But then luckily, Anders sent me a second email re-emphasizing his credentials and who he was. And I answered it, said, yes, I'd be most interested to talk about their concept for the film. And I think he literally got on the next plane from Copenhagen to Washington, D.C. And he came to my house and we spoke for several hours. And by the time he left, we both had agreed that we would do our best to try to adapt the book, The Inextinguishable Symphony, into this film, which is now known as Winter Journey.
What are some of the challenges of doing that, turning your book into a film?
Well, first of all, as is the case with many adaptations of books, the film can really only concentrate on a portion of the book. The book tries to tell the story of my family, most prominently my mother and father, but also my father's younger brother and younger sister, and both of his parents, and my mother, who was an only child, her mother and father. I tell the story of also the very interesting organization that we're a part of, the Jüdischer Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Association, a marvelous amalgam of artists who performed strictly for Jewish audiences between 1933 and 1941. I tell the story of my parents finding each other in the Kulturbund and their love affair. And as a background, I try to tell the history of Germany between 1933 and 1941, when my parents were lucky enough to escape. So it was up to Honors to really focus things, to focus the story primarily on the father-son relationship, my attempting to learn about my own past as gleaned from my father. So those people who have seen the film know that much of it is recreated conversations between my father and me. And the recreations are very much based upon reality, the conversations I had with him after he and my mother had retired and moved to Tucson, Arizona. My mom, alas, died in 1984, and it wasn't until several years later that I began talking to my father about his memories of Germany.
Well, you know, it's a struggle for Holocaust survivors who experienced such extraordinary circumstances to remember and to share those memories. And what courage you had to even pose those questions, because they were challenging for you and challenging for your father to respond. And I'm sure that was a process of many years of unraveling. And we see that in the film, and we read that in the book itself. And in the process of making the film, or the film itself, were there expectations you had? Did things turn out as you expected or differently?
Well, when I fantasized about the Inextinguishable Symphony becoming a film, I naturally thought of it as like a 2.5-hour feature film with wonderful actors cast in all the important parts. I thought of Kenneth Branagh perhaps as Kurt Singer, the artistic director of the Kulturbund. Brad Pitt would play me, of course, because we share the same devilish good looks. So I thought of it as a feature film, that it would tell the whole story that the book tells. But Honors, of course, being the experienced filmmaker that he is, really, I think, limited his scope in a very, very clever way and fascinating way, and very moving way as well. So while it's not the film that I would have made, I, of course, am not a filmmaker, so I would not have known what I was doing. I think the film that Honors made is just marvelous, undergirded by the unbelievably powerful and poignant performance by Bruno Ganz, which, as Pamela pointed out, was the very final film in his career.
Well, it's interesting that you pointed out that he chose to focus on the father-son relationship, and probably that choice of actor, so extraordinary to have an actor such as Bruno Ganz playing your father. What was that like for you?
Well, first of all, Honors had tried another older German actor with a very fine reputation, and he essentially did a screen test, and I thought he was wonderful. But then several weeks later, Honors announced with great joy and glee and excitement that he had sent the script to Bruno Ganz's agent, and the agent sent it to Bruno, and Bruno apparently read it over once and instantly decided that he wanted to do the part. Many of your viewers will remember Bruno Ganz as Adolf Hitler in the film Downfall, which came out, I think, about 15 years ago. And there are those who speculated that Bruno wanted to sort of even the scales just a bit by having played Hitler, then playing a survivor of the Holocaust, my father, George Goldsmith. When I met him in Tucson, the Arizona scenes were filmed in Tucson in January of 2018. When I met him, I fully expected him to take me by the elbow and move me several yards away from other ears and to say, all right, Martin, I would like you to tell me everything you can remember about your father's physical characteristics, how he spoke, how he walked, any tics he had, did he smoke a pipe, anything you can remember about your father, I want you to tell me. And it turned out to be exactly the opposite. He had no desire at all to learn anything about the real George Goldsmith. He created his character based on the script and on his brilliance as an actor. And I have to tell you, Minna, there are numerous times to this day when I see the film, I forget at times that I'm watching the great Bruno Ganz, and I think that's my dad.
You have a second father now.
Yeah, he managed to really embody my father in so many ways. There is one of my favorite scenes in the film, again, is based on an actual conversation that I had with my dad. And he describes how my mother and he lived in this rather ratty apartment on Prinzenstrasse, near where the Kulturbund had its theater. And their landlord was a man by the name of Adolf Cohen. And Adolf Cohen kept the suitcase by the front door. And my father once asked him, why do you have the suitcase by the front door? And Adolf Cohen replied, well, I want to have something to take with me when the Gestapo comes for me. And my father said, what? And Adolf Cohen said, haven't you heard? Don't you know we're all going to be burned? And my father said, oh, this is nonsense. This is fairy tales. And Adolf Cohen said, you will remember Adolf Cohen. That is the actual conversation that my father relayed to me. And in the scene in the film, Bruno Ganz utters those lines almost exactly the way I recall my father speaking to me, with the same emphasis on the words, the same rhythm of the sentences. It's really uncanny the way he created a character that is so close to my father.
It's really haunting. And it's an extraordinary thing that happened there, that he could capture something of your father from his own creation without, copying.
Exactly.
A true actor. So it's interesting that the dramatic moments in the film, do they coincide with the points that you thought dramatically in your book? These turning points of when your father, for example, makes a decision to leave for Sweden. And then you see an idealistic person who's ready to leave and gets a call to play the flute with the Kulturbund. And suddenly, the music absorbs him and he is more dedicated to his music than to the reality. And, the reality to stay when he meets your mother in the orchestra. Are these the dramatic points that you wanted to see in the film?
They are definitely. There is one moment, one of those scenes where Honors truncated the actual story just a bit in the interest of time. He wanted the film to be about 90 minutes long. he didn't want it to run too much longer than that. The actual story is that in 1936, March of 1936, the Nuremberg laws had been issued the previous November. Jews were stripped of their citizenship in Germany. Lots of other nasty things were done. That is my dad. About the time he was preparing to emigrate from Germany to Sweden. And in fact, he found himself in an apartment over a milk bar in Stockholm and was all set to move to Sweden in March of 1936 when the phone rang, and he was living in this apartment in the German city of Karlsruhe. And the fellow at the other end of the phone said to my father, there is a flutist who plays with the Kulturbund Orchestra in Frankfurt. He's come down with a very bad cold. Would you please fill in for him tonight? And over the weekend, there are 2 concerts. And my father at first said, no, I really can't. There are boxes all over the apartment. I'm about to move to Sweden. But the fellow on the other end of the phone was very persuasive. So my father agreed, threw a few things into a suitcase, took the train from Karlsruhe up to Frankfurt, played those 2 concerts, one in Frankfurt, one in Hamburg, and then a couple of days later, in fact, moved to Sweden. But he couldn't forget the lovely young violist he had met during those 2 concerts, during the rehearsals for those concerts. He wrote her a letter from Stockholm to Frankfurt, that is my mom, at about that very time, 1935, 1936. My mother answered, and an epistolary relationship began between Stockholm and Frankfurt. And when the same flutist who had gotten sick in March emigrated to Palestine in August, my father moved back from the relative safety of Sweden to Nazi Germany to be with the woman who would become his wife and my mother. In the film, Honors decided that that would take just a bit too long to describe and to dramatize and so on. So in the film, my father just decides not to move to Sweden and to stay in Frankfurt with my mom. And it makes perfect sense in the film. I suppose I would have, and I did, in fact, I lobbied Honors to include the actual story, which I think is quite romantic, the most romantic story I know, in fact. But Honors, he obviously had very, very good reasons for keeping things a bit brisk. So that is one thing that didn't quite leave the cutting room floor. But the other very important moment when my father on Kristallnacht decides to get on a train and head to Dusseldorf, where my mother was staying with her parents. That is a very dramatic part of the film, as it should have been. As is that moment towards the end of the film where my father has gotten all the papers for his wife and for himself, which enabled him to get on the train in Berlin in the very end of May 1941 and take the train to Lisbon, where they caught the good ship Mugino, which left Portugal on June the 10th, 1941, and arrived on Ellis Island on June 22nd, 1941. And to get those final papers stamped, he had to go to Gestapo headquarters. And I think that moment where the Nazi officials screamed at my father for getting rainwater onto his nice clean floor, that was a moment that stayed with my father for the rest of his life. And I think Bruno Gans's, the way he tells that moment in his story is quite chilling and marvelous.
Well, thank you for sharing that, especially the much more convoluted story about your father leaving for Sweden and then returning to Nazi Germany. That is a remarkable love story. And you know, what we see in the film, and perhaps you saw this in your lifetime with your dad, is the idealism that he showed as a young man in terms of doing things for love and doing things for music. And then the reality, but he does say constantly, and I guess that's what you heard, is that it was luck, that he managed, you know, he was there because it was just luck, but a lot of it was circumstance of making those decisions.
Oh, exactly. No, I think you allude to another of my favorite moments in the film, where I tell my father that I learned what happened to his father after he was arrested on Kristallnacht, that he was beaten and sent to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen. And Bruno, as my father in the film, says, yes, as I told you, I was always very, very lucky. But you can see tears in his eyes. It's cinematography. The cinematography is beautiful at that moment. You see the lights of Tucson twinkling behind him in purple dusk having descended, and those tears in his eyes when he says, I was always very, very lucky. You can tell that he is taking his complete range of emotions and sort of shoving them down as deeply as he can.
Yes, I mean, there's where you see a great actor and you just watch his face and those eyes and the teary eyes and the control, and you know the feelings are so deep, and it's truly, truly moving moment. And I'm glad that you mentioned this turning point after Kristallnacht, where he travels, risks his life to travel to Düsseldorf, and he enters the home of Rosemary's parents, and they're making music as if in another world, as if what was happening did not face them. And here's someone who took a train and saw a synagogue burning. This juxtaposition must have been extraordinary.
Well, again, here's a part of the book that doesn't make it onto the film. My parents, after Kristallnacht, they decided to get married. And married they were on Friday, December 13th, 1939. I'm sorry, December 13th, 1938. They were married by the local justice of the peace. The ceremony took place in his offices, which were dominated by a floor-to-ceiling portrait of Adolf Hitler, a cape draped theatrically over his shoulders, his hand resting on the head of a German shepherd, the two of them looking out from their perch in Berchtesgaden. And my father remembered that when they entered the Justice of the Peace offices, the JP was in his full Nazi uniform, and he and my mother's father, my grandfather, Julian Gumpert, who ran a music conservatory in Düsseldorf and was my mother's first teacher, but the JP and my father were yucking it up, shaking hands, clapping each other on the back, acting as if they were old friends. My father remembered that as being very incongruous, given the fact that, that he and my mom and his father-in-law were all Jews in this office of the Justice of the Peace, dominated by this full-length portrait of Adolf Hitler. Well, as it happens, my grandfather would eventually leave Germany with a woman, not his wife, and one of his students and his Stradivarius violin. And he managed to leave town on an airplane, which is certainly not how most Jews left Germany. So there's always been a little question about what sort of relationship my mother's father had with the local Nazi authorities.
Well, I'm sure in the course of writing your book and even visiting Germany with your father, you got a chance to ask him a lot of questions. What were some of the discoveries you made about your parents' life and their stories that you haven't already shared with us?
Let's see. Well, the interesting thing about talking to my father, and any person who is tuned in tonight via Zoom who may be of a certain age and may have talked to a parent who had experiences in Nazi Germany, they will not be at all surprised to learn that my father remembered some things with crystal clarity and some things not at all, or at least he claimed not to remember. And there's actually a picture of my father and me in 1999, very shortly after the conversations depicted in the film. But some things he did not remember at all, especially when when the questions veered towards the more personal, at least the more personal regarding his family, what had happened to his father and his younger brother, who parenthetically were two of the 900 passengers on board the ill-fated Jewish refugee ship St. Louis that was turned away from Cuba, the United States, and Canada before being sent back to Europe a deal was brokered whereby the passengers on board the St. Louis could disembark in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland. My grandfather and uncle disembarked in France. They were then sent from one camp to another over the next 3 years before being sent to their deaths in Auschwitz in August of 1942. Anything having to do with that, my father did not want to speak about at all. But some things he remembered quite clearly. This is touched on briefly in the film. New Year's Eve, 1938, my father and mother took a streetcar to the end of town in Frankfurt, and then got on a horse-drawn sleigh and went out to an inn in the Taunus Mountains, New Year's Eve, 1938. And that's when, as my father tells me in the film, and as it was in real life, he said, that is the night your mother and I first made love. And I, of course, immediately said, TMI, too much information, thanks, Dad. Let's move on to another subject, shall we? So there were some things I learned that I found fascinating, some things I just touched on and moved on.
By the way, Bruno Ganz's expression when he talks about that first night when they made love is just priceless, just absolutely moving and priceless. We're running short on time, but I want to ask you a question, another question yet. So the title of this film is Winter Journey. The title of your book was The Inextinguishable Symphony. Could you comment on the significance of those titles for the choice of the book and the film?
Well, the book is called The Inextinguishable Symphony, after a piece of music that I heartily recommend to anybody listening who has perhaps not made its acquaintance yet. It's the fourth symphony, the fourth of 6 symphonies written by a great Danish composer of the late 19th and early 20th century named Carl Nielsen. And there's a nice connection between the fact that Carl Nielsen was Danish and Anders Østergaard, the director of the film, is Danish. I think that's perhaps one of the reasons he wanted to do the film. But the symphony, the fourth symphony, the Inextinguishable Symphony by Nielsen, was written as a reaction to the First World War. And there's a certain degree of violent conflict in the symphony. But Nielsen was always a very optimistic man. And he wrote at the head of the score that even should mankind manage to destroy itself, he was referring to the First World War, life will return, whether it be bird life or animal life. And he went on to say, music is life, and like life, inextinguishable, thus the name of his fourth symphony. And it very much appealed to me as the title of the book. Winter Journey, Winterreise, is a cycle of 24 songs by Franz Schubert, written in the last year of his life. And he told his friends that he'd written a series of what he called terrifying songs. It's basically the story of a young man who is lost at love, and he leaves his town and wanders through the countryside, losing more and more of his sanity, actually. And finally, at the end of the song cycle, he contemplates joining an old hurdy-gurdy man standing barefoot on the ice, snapped at by growling dogs. It's an amazing series of songs. The very first song begins with the words, Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus, which means a stranger I arrived, a stranger I depart. It's a beautiful, beautiful song, and one that my father would often quote. He would often sing those opening lines, Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus. And I mentioned that to Anders, and in the very opening scene of the film, we see Bruno Ganz singing those lines. And it struck Anders right away as being the perfect title. Obviously, George Goldsmith in the winter of his life, but there's also a sadness and a certain resignation to the whole song cycle that fits the mood of the film and my father's mood.
Thank you, Martin. I see that we have questions coming in from our viewers, and so I would like to welcome Pamela back so that she can assist us in responding to some of those questions. And I want to thank you, Martin, and congratulate you on not only a compelling book, but being part of this compelling film the story of your parents, and for having the courage to have taken on that journey and bringing this to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minna. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. I would just parlay with that. I was really curious myself, and I will ask just a few of my own before we get to questions, but we do have quite a few, so I want to get to everyone's questions. I was curious about there's a sort of shoemaker's daughter has no shoes aspect of those of us who are either the children or grandchildren of survivors or people who've experienced tremendous loss. And we often have to recapture our own stories and in ways. You captured it in one way through your book, and the film recaptures it in a different way. It uses a lot of constructive archive. It plays with the notion of documentary. It uses your own interviews, and I don't know if they are absolutely verbatim, the conversations that you had, but I'm wondering if you could take a moment on contrasting the process of reconstructing your own family story in a book versus the way that it was reconstructed in the film.
Well, my first thought is that the book was entirely my creation, whereas the film is largely Honor's. He assigned me several scenes to write, and I wrote those scenes, but in many cases I was essentially just transcribing what I had already written in the book because it was the conversation that I recalled from my father. So I was able to hit upon a format for the book where it was as if I were telling three stories with a scrim between each one. The backdrop was the history of Germany between, well, roughly the end of the First World War and 1941. So giving a context to what happened to my family being stand-ins for the 6 million people who were murdered by the Nazis during the final solution. So that's sort of the background. The foreground of that was this extraordinary organization my parents were part of, the Jewish Kulturbund, the Cultural Association, made up entirely of Jewish actors, musicians, dancers, singers, artists who had been part of German opera companies, theater companies, and orchestras, and were booted out when the Nazis came to power in 1933. And my mother joined the ensemble in 1935, and my father, as I described it earlier, joined in 1936. And so that was sort of the second level. And the primary level was just the story of my parents and their families. So there are the Goldschmidts and the Gumperts. My mother's maiden name was Gumpert. Behind them, separated by a scrim, was the Kulturbund. Behind that, separated by a scrim, was the history of the country. So I was able to construct that whole format on my own, and I obviously had total artistic control over the book, whereas it was Honor's who had the brilliant theatrical eye and mind to create the film.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I know that Anders has often in his previous films talked about the notion of narrative nonfiction. And that is a concept that he's used in other films. I know he's a big fan also of Wim Wenders, and there were moments in this film that reminded me a lot of Wim Wenders' 3D film about, Pina Bausch, which is an incredible film, but it also shows a city and the sort of setting, the winter journey, and that notion of showing the desert also and where it was shot, and then having the interplay of the documentary and all of this. I'm just wondering, how is it that you understood, dare I say, in a moment of fake news and forget the notion of Holocaust denial, when you create a notion of narrative nonfiction, isn't it tricky?
Well, yes, I suppose it can be, but to the degree that I know the way Honor has used it, I think it works extremely well. Very briefly, he made a film called 1989, which is about the fall of the Berlin Wall, essentially, and the whole Iron Curtain, which collapsed. And the historical record shows that just before the Iron Curtain collapsed, the East German president, Erich Honecker, flew to Moscow to talk to Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev told Honecker that he would not order Soviet tanks into East Germany the way the way Brezhnev had ordered tanks into Czechoslovakia in 1968 to crush the Prague Spring. So Honecker went back to East Germany, and when the wall was breached, he was unable to stop it, knowing that he would not get backup from the Soviets. That was the bottom line of what the conversation was about. But in his film 1989, Honors created an actual conversation, and he cast actors to play Gorbachev and Honecker. And so you see them discussing the options that eventually led to Gorbachev saying what he did. So we arrive at the same place, that history tells us where we should be, but thanks to Honors, we got a different take on how it happened.
Well, what's so amazing, and I'll refer to Mindy Blasky's question in the Q&A, and she asked, where did the documentary footage come from? And I would just second that with that we're so used to Holocaust footage, which does not appear at all really in the film. And so if you could respond to any of the images that came up in the documentary footage.
Well, first of all, there were some public domain images. I mean, there's the book burning. There is a scene where Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, as he was called, is addressing one of his rallies. There is a picture of a film of Hitler delivering one of his screeds. Those are all, as I say, in the public domain. But Honors and Erzsébet, his wife, spent many hours combing through the archives at the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, a wonderful museum that in 1992 had put together an exhibition about the Kulturbund. So many of the photographs that you see in the film of Hans Hinkel and Kurt Singer and other members of the Kulturbund, there are photographs of the Kulturbund Orchestra that include my father and my mother, actual photographs of my mom and dad in the orchestra. So they did a lot of work to find those archival materials, as I say, some in the public domain, some never before seen on screen.
So I have a slightly, I don't love asking compound questions, but it's really about your participation in the film. And you are off camera. It is your voice only. I'm wondering a little bit about how that came to be. And there was a question in the chat also from Mindy, who's very interested, obviously, in the film. I love you, Mindy, for asking lots of questions. She says, how brave you were to confront and challenge him. But someone else commented, I think it is Adele, that did you really speak to your father in the manner that you did? You are sort of the antagonist of the film. You are fairly confrontational and pushing him or utzing him along the way. So can you speak to both your off-camera experience as well as the huge presence that you have in really pushing your father in those conversations?
Well, gosh, I wish we had hours more to talk, and we could maybe retire socially distanced, of course, to one of Seattle's great late evening meeting places and eating places. Again, if Mindy or anyone else watching has had a parent who survived the Holocaust, you'll probably back up my statement that they were really hard to talk to when it came to those issues, and that they can certainly be very controlling. Having lost control over their lives, they want very much to be able to control whatever it is they can control. My father was Prussian to begin with, so he probably leaned in this direction anyhow. But as I knew him, he was a bit of a martinet. I mean, if we were supposed to leave for a concert at 7 o'clock, by God, it shouldn't be 7:01 or 7:02 or 30 seconds after 7 o'clock. We had to walk out the door on the stroke of 7 p.m. He was very controlling, which I have come to understand a lot more in my later years. But let me just go back to when I was doing research for the book, I interviewed a man by the name of Henry Meyer. Henry Meyer was one of the youngest members of the Kulturbund. He was also 18 when he joined. He had a brother. Both Henry and his brother were sent to Auschwitz. The brother was murdered. Henry managed to escape and came to this country where he became the second violinist of the LaSalle String Quartet, a very distinguished string quartet in the Midwest. So I interviewed Henry, and what he told me very nearly broke my heart, which is that he said, I remember your father as the life of the party. He was the one who would always suggest that we go out for a party after a concert. He was the one who would remember so-and-so's birthday and would present that person with a gift. He would be the one launching into happy birthday. He was the life of the party, which is about 180 degrees opposite of what I recall my father, who was taciturn, who was grumpy for the most part, who stuck to himself, did not want to see friends. Henry Meyer once actually, after all of them had come to this country, suggested they meet, and they did meet, but my father just was very off-putting, and I don't think they saw Henry or spoke to Henry ever again. So I think what happened to my father was the realization of what happened to his family. His father, his mother, his younger brother, his younger sister were all murdered. My grandfather and uncle in Auschwitz, my grandmother and aunt in a forest outside Riga, Latvia. And I think my father's demeanor changed in 1946 when my mother auditioned for the St. Louis Symphony. That was the time that those first grisly newsreels were coming out of Europe. My father was aware. He didn't learn for another 40 years about all the details, but he knew that his family had been murdered and he felt responsible. There was probably nothing he could have done to save them, but he felt that he didn't do enough. And so he, again, took refuge in trying to control what he could control. And it was not all that easy for my brother and me to grow up in such a household where we knew, even when things were not spoken, that something had happened that caused us to have no uncles or aunts or grandmothers or grandfathers. And I think in that scene that one of the viewers was referring to, it summed up all the frustrations and anger and sorrow and sympathy that I felt for my father, that he gave up music as an act of penance and sold furniture in a department store, a job he absolutely hated for the rest of his professional life. And as I did say to him in real life, and as I say in the film, you could have taught music, you could have played chamber music with your friends instead of condemning yourself to this job you hated. So yes, what that scene there in the film is very much based on more than one conversation I had with my father.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's just an incredible story of loss. And I know he never picked up his flute again, but your mother did, and your mother continued to play. And so you yourself, you have 50 years in the classical music and radio business, Sirius Radio. And so clearly the love of music was transferred to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how his winter journey became a little bit of your spring journey?
Well, as I write in the first chapter of the Inextinguishable Symphony, as my father told me many things of his life in Berlin and in Frankfurt, but particularly in Berlin when the war had already begun and they often had to escape English and American bombing raids by crowding into the subway stations where there were big signs that said no Jews allowed, but they figured it's a matter of life and death, let's sneak into the bomb shelter. And there was, as I may have mentioned earlier, there was a curfew that mandated that Jews be off the streets by 8 p.m. during the winter and 9 p.m. during the summertime. But my parents often would flout those rules by sneaking through the streets after curfew to play chamber music with their friends. And they would often break the law twice by playing forbidden composers such as Beethoven or Brahms or Schumann, as the Gestapo ruled that for a Jew to play a German piece of music was to defile that music. So, but playing chamber music was terribly important to my parents. And as I write in the opening chapter of the Inextinguishable Symphony, as I heard my father tell me his story, I realized that I had somehow inherited the belief that music can not only enrich your life, it is sometimes worth risking your life for. So I think I've always treated my job, which I've loved, really introducing music for all this time and interviewing many great musicians. I guess I always, on some sort of subterranean level, thought that I was not just announcing music on the radio, that I was somehow doing my best to preserve this art that my parents quite literally risked their lives for.
Mm. Wow. I'm going to try to get through some of these questions because there are quite a few. So I'm going to give up my own airtime and ask them. Robert asks, can you talk about the bike riding scene, which seemed truly incongruous considering that he was going back in town? Maybe you can remind us a little bit what that scene was. And we have maybe about 7 or 8 more questions to get through.
Okay. Well, quickly, I imagine it's the part where Bruno, or my father, mentions that my mother and he enjoyed taking bicycle rides out into the Taunus Mountains, the region outside Frankfurt. And in Berlin, they also enjoyed taking bike rides. And it was just a way for them to escape the ugliness of the increasingly mean streets of Nazi Germany. They did whatever they could, as most people did whatever they could, to escape that.
Makes me think of some of the stories of Dr. Seuss and how they were bike riders escaped Germany holding the Dr. Seuss, writing under their arms, although we're not going to talk about Dr. Seuss right now. Mindy asks, well, this is a question I'm seeing a number of times, which is questions, obviously, you've talked about Winter Journey and the line about stranger in a strange land, but this notion of being a stranger due to being an immigrant, guilt, these are pretty heavy concepts. And how did you talk about this with your father? And did he have a sense of his own feeling guilty?
Well, I think a very, very important aspect of my father's character that doesn't, I think, quite come out. Well, it does. I'm sorry. Let me amend that. It is alluded to in the film. But my father loved Germany to the end of his days. He always thought that the Nazis were the interlopers. They arrived in 1933. They were driven out in 1945. And there are times in the film, in fact, when I say, look, Dad, you couldn't have just been in a little bubble playing Mozart all of your life. You surely could have seen what was happening. And they were the Nazis, you were the Jews. And again, my father chose to not be called a Jew, even though I would, as I pointed out to him, that his grandfather was Moses Goldschmidt, his great-grandfather was Levi Goldschmidt. He played in this Jewish organization that only allowed Jews to perform. But he said, essentially, Hitler said I was a Jew, I chose not to be one. So the Nazis were the interlopers. He loved Germany, and alas, in his later years, my father was afflicted with Alzheimer's. And he came to live near us here in Maryland at an Alzheimer's facility. And I would visit him 3 or 4 times a week. And he was never happier than when he and I would discuss a return trip to Germany. And he had been to Germany since 1946 several times. The first time, as I mentioned in the film, in 1962 when I was 10. And he'd been several times past then, after that. But at the Alzheimer's facility, we would often discuss how we would fly to Amsterdam and then take the train from Amsterdam to Oldenburg. He just loved trains. Mm. And he would show me around the Schlossgarten, the castle gardens, the public park in Oldenburg, and we would feed the ducks and sit on a bench.
Mm. Beautiful memory. That's incredible.
And so I guess I slightly forgot the what the question was, but he was very much, he felt that he was a German, and I recall. So that he did always feel like he was a stranger in a strange land in America. He was certainly grateful to America for accepting him, but he never quite could understand my passion for baseball. He thought that classical music was not given long enough shrift. And certainly in Arizona, again, as Bruno Ganz points out in the very first scene of the film, he would have liked some more change of seasons and some green grass and some trees. So I always felt a bit of a stranger in the desert.
Well, the first moments of the film, and this gets to one of the questions about Tucson from Sharon Rutzik. Tucson, so prominently figures in the film, the sort of desert landscape. One can't help but think about the title, Winter Journey, and the incongruity of the desert, as well as the Jewish idea of being in the desert, right? These 40 years spent outside of one's home. And I wonder about any of that resonance for you and how Tucson in the desert, what do you think of that choice?
Brilliant. As the woman pointed out, yes, the Jews were in the desert for 40 years. My father was in the desert for more than 20 years. And he wasn't, in 1981, when my mother retired from the Cleveland Orchestra, they moved to Tucson. My mother had visited Tucson on a tour with the orchestra and loved it. She loved the sun, she loved the low humidity. My father, on the other hand, was more of a Nordic type, and he liked, again, change of seasons and green grass and snow. And then my mother died after 3 years in Tucson. And you'd think, well, my father would think, there's nothing keeping me here now, and yet he stayed. And again, I wonder to what degree there was some kind of penance being paid as well. I think he enjoyed the fact that in February, when back in Cleveland it was 6 degrees below zero and 3 feet of snow, that in Tucson it was 75 degrees and brilliantly sunny. He enjoyed that, but he did always feel a stranger in a strange land. And yes, it is somewhat incongruous that the film be called Winter Journey with the images of snow and so on. And yet there is that scene towards the very end of the film when you see this moment of snow collapsing off of one of those giant saguaro cacti, which I think is a brilliant image and perfectly placed at that moment in the film.
Amazing. So we're going to ask our last two questions. So thank you everyone who's put things in the chat. There is a question in the Q&A from Linda, who asks a little bit more about the Jüdischer Kulturbund. She says, were artists of the Jüdischer Kulturbund given any protections over the rest of the community when restrictions were put on Jews, when things started to disintegrate? And I think it also connects to Mindy's other comment about the relationship to other musicians who I know that Music of Remembrance has certainly performed, and we've showed many films about those who performed in Theresienstadt.
No, the Kulturbund came into existence because the Nazis allowed it to come into existence, even though it was the brainchild of Kurt Singer and other of these displaced artists who had been kicked out of German orchestras, opera companies, and theater companies. It could only happen if the Nazis allowed it. And this fellow named Hans Hinkel was the liaison to Kurt Singer. His boss was Dr. Goebbels, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And the Nazis used the Kulturbund to deflect criticism of the way the Germans were treating the Jews. Goebbels was able to say, in effect, well, look, they have their own orchestra, their own opera company. If we were treating them as badly as you say we are, we wouldn't have afforded them that wonderful opportunity. So yes, if you were a member of the Kulturbund, you had to be Jewish. If you were a violinist or a flutist or a dancer or a singer, or if you took tickets at the box office, all of those things, you had to be a Jew. And only Jews were allowed to attend Kulturbund performances. And Jews who were members of the Kulturbund were, yes, they were given a certain bit of protection. Nothing happened to them on Kristallnacht, for instance. And in fact, after Kristallnacht, the Jews of the Kulturbund realized they had a little bit of leverage, and they insisted that some of their relatives who had been taken off to Dachau were to be released, or they would not continue to perform. And that, in fact, did happen. Some Jews were released from Dachau.
What do you feel is the future of this film, your participation in it? I know that this may not have been the film that you would have created. Do you see or envision it being a more Americanized version? This is a very European film to the extent of its patience with all of the mechanics of the film. What do you see as the future and the adaptation? What would you like to see happen with your parents' story?
Well, yes, I mean, as much as I admire Winter Journey, I think it's really a splendid achievement on many, many levels. I would like to see, I guess, what's called a feature film. I, for a while, fantasized of casting Anthony Hopkins as Kurt Singer, the artistic director of the Kulturbund, and finding some nice young actors to play my father and mother, and you know, Robert Redford to play me. We share a birthday and our good looks. So yes, I would like to see a 2-hour feature film, or a 17-hour series on Netflix or HBO or something like that. That's what I dream of. So if anybody watching tonight can help me make that happen, please send me an email. And if I don't reply right away, perhaps I'm thinking of you as of a Nigerian prince.
Well, we'd certainly got around back to that. So I think that's the perfect place to end. I'm so grateful to both of you and your stories. Minna, I thank you so much for being my partner in crime tonight. And you did a wonderful job pulling out some of Martin's stories. I really appreciate your participation. I've also put information about both purchasing the book, The Inextinguishable Symphony, as well as upcoming concerts for Music of Remembrance. There's an upcoming June 27th concert. I just want to thank again, Go to Pop-Up Seattle, as well as Music of Remembrance, for being the community partners and sponsors for today's film. Martin, it has been a joy and a pleasure to hear so many more stories. To see your face telling them is even better. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask if there's any other last comments that you have before we say goodbye, and thank you all for joining us. It's just a wonderful thing for us all to be together for an hour and talk about your film.
Well, I want to thank Minna for her wonderful questions and the work she does with Music for Remembrance, Music of Remembrance. And Pamela, thanks to you very much for your questions and for your enthusiasm about the film. Thank you for including it in this very distinguished series you have here in Seattle. And to people who've tuned in and have watched the film, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for you to share my family's story. Thank you very, very much. And I hope you'll tell your friends about the next 24 hours, their availability to see the film.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Pamela.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Seattle Jewish Film Festival on our official closing day. Again, we're playing some films all weekend, including Winter Journey. Tell your friends. Hopefully, we'll be back together again instead of virtually together again. But what a joy it is to be able to have a beautiful, focused, hour-long conversation with each other. That is one of the amazing engagement benefits of the Zoom world that we are in. Take care, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.